Thank you, Ascan Corla. Thank you, Taoiseach. This is an incredible, important day for the families who lost loved ones in the Stardust fire. But I'm conscious that any sense of relief today's apology may bring is tempered by the fact that they had to wait for far, far too long to hear it. Most of us in this chamber know what it's like to lose a family member, but few of us will have experienced the devastation of losing a loved one in such terrible circumstances. The fact that this pain was compounded by the state's unwillingness to correct the glaring flaws of those original investigations for so long is impossible to justify by anyone here today. The organs of the Irish state didn't respond when repeatedly confronted by contradictory evidence. It's a sobering indictment of our integrity as a nation, and one that we must reflect upon, uncomfortable though it may be for many of us in most powerful positions. I've spent some time since the verdict was announced last week going back over the pen portraits of the victims that have been read out by their families during the inquest's opening weeks. Reading about so many young lives cut short just as they were entering their prime is incredibly poignant. No one who died in that fire was over the age of 27. In fact, the vast majority were in their late teens or early 20s. I was 17 when that fire took place, and I remember the shock that spread over Dublin, the pall, the gloom that Sunday, and then on Monday morning going to school trying to make sense of what had happened. The fondness and affection with which the families talk about those they lost is both touching and heartbreaking. Young people finding love or seeking adventure, boyfriends and girlfriends with dreams of settling down and raising families of their own, fans of football and fashion, some who might have loved the Rolling Stones, others Dolly Parton or Diana Ross. Young people generously sharing their pay with their parents to help their families through tough times. The portrait that Thelma Fraser's family gave the inquest would stay with you. And I hope and trust they won't mind me sharing some of it just as an example with you now, so as I think it illustrates the incredible sense of loss that all the families have experienced. Barbara Fraser was just 6 years old when she watched her big sister do her hair and makeup and pick up her clothes ahead of the Valentine's disco. Growing up in a house full of boys in Ringsend, the two sisters shared a bed in the family's box room, despite the 14-year-old age difference between them. Thelma had hugged her little sister Barbara that night, given her a kiss and tucked her into bed before she headed to Artane. The next morning, her father woke her frantically, shouting at her if she knew where Thelma was. "That was the night," she said, "they stole my sister. That stole my happy family, that stole my childhood," Barbara told the inquest. The big sister, who Barbara had idolised, wasn't there when she made her first Holy Communion a year later, nor at any of the other life events that form such important markers in a young person's life. "In my teens for advice," as she said, "my big sister should have been there. In my preparations for my wedding, my sister should have been there. When I had my daughter, my sister should have been there." Thelma's brother Morris recalled how the house went from being a happy home full of life and laughter to just a house. Everyone could and should, I'd urge, read the portraits themselves if they haven't already. Many of the families knew deep down that the official account of how their children had died wasn't right. The original tribunal had certainly given the impression of thoroughness, sitting for 122 days, hearing from more than 350 witnesses. But the conclusions it reached were clearly flawed. Despite unearthing no evidence to indicate that the fire was started deliberately, it nevertheless concluded that the most probable explanation was that it was the result of arson. We've witnessed this blaming of victims before, and I'm not the first to note the awful similarity to the Hillsborough Stadium disaster, where another devastated community was left to battle the authorities for decades in order to get justice. And just as with the Hillsborough campaign, the Stardust families were forced to call on every possible reserve of resilience and determination so as to force a disinterested state to listen. Just as with Hillsborough, the families eventually succeeded in getting an order for new inquests to be held. with the Attorney General accepting their argument that the original inquest had been too narrowly focused on the medical cause of their loved ones' deaths and not enough on the wider circumstances behind them. Last week, the families got their answer, the answer that they had known for decades, but were continually denied by the state, that their loved ones had been unlawfully killed. The families have every right to be angry at the state which denied them that truth for so long. What further compounds the sense of tragedy is that it was so avoidable if only proper fire, health and safety rules had been followed. Now, we might be tempted to look back at the early 80s as an almost backward time compared to now, but rules and responsibilities around fire safety were well established. The Stardust nightclub was also known not to be following them. A Dublin Corporation planning official had identified that the wrong type of tile was being used on the nightclub's walls, but it felt it was up to the fire brigade to object and not his. Numerous complaints have been made by a corporation inspector about the venue's exits being blocked, and yet it continued to operate. Just 2 weeks before the fire, the corporation had complained to Patrick Butterley that exits had been blocked during a packed concert at the venue. Assurances were given, but not honoured. It's right that the Taoiseach has offered you, the relatives, a full state apology today. It is one you have waited far too long for. As W.B. Yeats famously wrote, that too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. But the pen portraits that were so lovingly composed show that that is not the case for you. Your sacrifice has undoubtedly been for too long, but the love and affection you continue to hold in your hearts for the sons, daughters, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, aunts and uncles you have lost is undeniable. I'd like to conclude Las Concorla by quoting another of the pen portraits, this time but from Michael French, as recounted by his sister Caroline. She recalled how Michael would take his young siblings to St Anne's Park on the crossbar, the yellow racer he made himself, or dance around the kitchen with his mother when she needed cheering up. His dream, she said, was to make life a little easier for his mother. Michael was a legend. He was our big brother and our rock, she recalled. Young lives, cut short, but the cherished memories remained. You, their loved ones, have kept those memories alive. You're an example of all that is good in our country. Thank you.